In your book, Desire for Destruction, you call for a holistic approach to combating terrorism. And I think we over identify with terrorism sometimes because it went from this whole, more the international kind of terrorism to, kids yelling at each other in school in some way. But at the same time, there's an uptick in violence within society, within the world, everything that's going on, from suicide bombers to mass shooters, all of that. And you mentioned that, violence in our society is it's an indicator of how healthy our society is. So can you unpack that one, the holistic approach and what all that means?
Definitely. It's a great question, and it's all what my book is about. So because I felt marginalized growing up, I always identified with marginalized people. People are ostracized, bullied, shunned, mocked, ridiculed, and throughout my life, I've always stuck up for them and tried to show them that someone cared. So in my work with domestic mass shooters, what we found in our research, which actually we won an award for it, which I'm getting next year.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes, thank you. It was so much work. It was a labor of love, really. For like 5 years, I studied court records of these domestic mass shooters, and I spoke to forensic psychiatrists and psychologists who would evaluate them. And what we found was that often these children are marginalized, isolated, ostracized. They come from families that have frequent dislocations, so they're constantly moving and they can never really get roots or develop friendships. They often feel humiliated and shunned by society. And often they do get identified as being troubled. The school shooters that I studied often are expelled from school or identified by the school as having mental health issues. Either they're psychotic or depressed, and often they also are identified by law enforcement. Many of the adult mass shooters had criminal records and had mental health issues, and they're identified as troubled, but somehow tragically they fall through the cracks. They don't get the psychiatric care that they so desperately need. And this is what my book is about. Often it's mental health stigma, which is people are embarrassed to admit that either their child is psychotic or they're psychotic, that their child has homicidal suicidal ideation, or the perpetrator has homicidal suicidal ideation. Often they're delusional and they believe, for instance, the mass shooter in North Carolina felt that there was race wars going on, and he wanted to wake people up. He wanted to wake white people up that Black men were raping white women and that there was a race war between Black and white people. He's the one that went into the Emmanuel Church in South Carolina and killed all those prominent Black people. I mean, it was a horrific crime, but he heard voices. He was psychotic. He had downward drift. He was ostracized, marginalized, couldn't hold a job. He didn't really have any friends or contact with his family, and didn't want mental health treatment. And also, I should say, they're often the smartest person in the room, as this person was. He had a high IQ, smarter often than doctors and judges and teachers and family members. And they feel if they're psychiatrically diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or depression, that their delusional message will not be heard, which it probably wouldn't be, and that it wouldn't come out. So they don't want psychiatric care often. Mm-hmm. So what we found in our study was that 87.5% of domestic mass shooters had undiagnosed, untreated psychiatric illness, and that often if they survived and were in prison, ironically, then they got the psychiatric care that they so desperately needed. and often were put on atypical antipsychotic long-acting antipsychotic medications, and within 10 days weren't hearing voices anymore, expressed profound regret for shooting their parents and schoolmates, often became model prisoners in the jail, got their GED, got their BA degree, became voracious readers of classical literature, were the electrician in the penal system, and taught yoga to their fellow prisoners, and had a spiritual practice where they actually prayed for the people that they killed because they needed to be on antipsychotic medication. And I often say this, which is there is no difference in having schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder and having heart disease and needing a cardiac medication. There shouldn't be any shame with it. It's a biological disorder, and sometimes it's genetically inherited. And it's like having diabetes or heart disease or developing cancer. These are things that are medically, organically based and that need treatment. So I feel that very much so, the violence in our society is an indicator of how sick our society is, because what we do or don't do as an individual has ramifications. So if you see someone being bullied and shunned, do you reach out to that person? Do you just say hi? How are you? Do you look in their eyes and say something's not wrong? I want to talk to you. I want to buy you a cup of coffee. Or do we ignore those people? Are we so self-consumed with ourselves and our safety and so scared and frightened that we don't want to reach out to those type of people because they are often are scary people? Do we reach out to people who are suffering in wars and or just even our next door neighbor? There's a great TED Talk. It's Aaron Stark, and the name of the TED Talk is I Was Almost a School Shooter. And it's this lovely man, super bright, high IQ, typical to most of these domestic mass shooters, who grew up in a family that dislocated frequently. He was poor. He didn't have proper clothes or food growing up, and he was mocked and ridiculed because he was big person, and he was going to go into his high school, and get revenge which is a normal thing. The feeling of revenge is a normal thing. All of us experience it. We want revenge for what we feel is wrong. And he was going to go to school, become a school shooter. That he went to say goodbye to his next door neighbor. The next door neighbor simply said, "Something is not right here. You don't look right. I want to talk to you." Gave him some food. And just a simple act of kindness, one simple act of kindness, that's all that it took for him not to be a school shooter. And that's what my message is really in my book. And a lot of people told me not to go to Chechnya. A lot of my colleagues think I'm crazy to have gone down to 9/11. They never would have gone down to help. And I have no regrets I'm proud of what I did. I know I helped a lot of people at 9/11. It turned out to be other first responders and family members and construction workers, but I helped a lot of people down there, and I certainly helped a lot of people in Chechnya as well. And if I made the difference in one person's mind that someone cares enough to help them and is going to go to Chechnya and then bring them back to get medical care, and that they feel that they're supported and seen and not shunned. Chechnya was largely internationally shunned. It was globally ignored because Chechens are Muslim, and also the West was quick to get on board with Putin against the war against terrorism. And they ignored history. And then this is another example. They ignored what was going on in Chechnya, and then Putin did it again. With no feelings, no regard, because he knew no one would care in Syria and Georgia. And then he did it in Ukraine. And I think partly because we identify more with Ukrainians because they're blonde-haired, blue-eyed, we seem to wake up and, show outrage that this is a genocide, and then give support to the Ukrainians. But Putin's been doing this for decades, and that's another indicator, like how healthy or divisive our society is. And it's can we listen to each other if we have differing opinions? Can we be respectful and make space for other people, especially if they have differing opinions? This is an indicator really of how either divisive our world is or how well we're doing. And I feel like the gun violence is really an indicator in particular of America, how divisive, divided we are, and how there's such a desperate need for us to come together. To me, it's showing human kindness to people that are invisible, that fall through the cracks. The Oxford High School shooter in Michigan is a great example of that, where his parents probably didn't receive love and were traumatized growing up themselves. And then they had a son and they didn't know how to be actively engaged with him, to really take serious symptoms that he was telling them, apparently through news reports, that he heard voices, he had paranoid ideation at home, that people were out to get him, that he was suicidal. The school had called in the parents several times that he was suicidal, that they needed to get him psychiatric care, and they dismissed it, didn't take it serious. And then the day of the shooting, also then the father bought him a gun. And when he asked his parents for psychiatric help, they mocked him and told him to suck it up. And the day of the shooting, the school saw that he had drawn this picture of a gun and with blood. And he said, blood, blood everywhere. The thoughts won't stop. Please help me.
Yeah.
And I think the school in this instance did a really good job with him. Although I do think there needs to be more of an interdisciplinary approach between school, parents, law enforcement, and mental health workers, so something like this doesn't happen again, where a poor kid who's suffering with schizophrenia doesn't get diagnosed and treated. But they did call in the parents. The parents didn't bother to tell the school that they had bought him a gun. Mm-hmm. And then the school didn't bother to check his backpack to see that his gun was in his backpack. And the parents, I guess, didn't bother to notice that the gun was missing from their house. The parents refused to bring him for psychiatric care, so the school put him back into class. And he killed I think he killed four kids and wounded many. And if you listen to his videotape, he says the motivation for his killing other students was that he wanted to show them how alone and isolated they were. He wanted to kill the prettiest girl in the class because he wanted to teach her a lesson of how alone they are. And this is an awareness of a 15-year-old. Like, he doesn't have the skills or the awareness or the knowledge to know that, unfortunately, it was his child experience that actually he's not really isolated or alone, that there were people who cared, although he didn't have access to them. And it's just it's a preventable tragedy in my mind, that this poor kid who was suffering from schizophrenia, which is what it seems like, his parents wouldn't bring him to a psychiatrist, probably because they were embarrassed, or
there's that stigmatism that's out there, right? There's still a lot of people still have that stigmatism. And I think it's one of those things that drives me a little bit bonkers sometimes when I think about it here. We're a first world country, and we don't dedicate everybody has mental health, problems at some point, and when I talk to some people and they're like, oh, I'm struggling in their 40s or 50s, I'm like, it's interesting that what we call it a midlife crisis. I'm like, you've just dealt with a lot of stuff and your brain's kind of, it's maxed out. I find it interesting with speaking about the marginalized people in society and how this, there's a lot of this, predominates with them. And, there was the shooting this last weekend at the Super Bowl party. I don't know what it is, Super Bowl parade in St. Louis, I believe it was, or Kansas City, somewhere up there. And they, it's coming out now that what it sounds like to me was it was 3 people who were in gangs, and, gang members are marginalized. You actually, I know you speak about and refer, I think, in your book to Muhammad Atta, one of the ringleaders of 9/11, how he was going down this route, and that what led him. Can you go into Muhammad Atta? Because we tend to think of Muhammad Atta, I think, as this, here's this mastermind, which he was, and all that. But at the end of the day, he's just a guy who committed a bigger act or a more impactful act of violence based upon this lifetime of, and Muhammad Atta hits with me a little bit too, because when I was overseas, spending all the years, I was one of the key leaders at the Baghdad embassy for embassy security and stuff. Is we knew that the suicide bombers, a lot of times, sometimes it was, they would grab a person who and they held their family, or there was a reason, but a lot of the time, I'd say the majority of the time, they found these disaffected young men who didn't have anything going, promised them the 72 virgins and everybody will know your name, and let's pump you up, and here's a suicide belt, here's a suicide car, go drive it in, and go down that road.
Absolutely. And not just the 72 virgins, but often their families become very prominent. They're given a lot of money for the suicide, terrorism, and their exalted status. Their family has an exalted status of both power and money in their communities. But no, I'd love to talk about Muhammad Atta, because he's a perfect example of what I talk about in terms of psychoanalytic and spiritual perspectives on terrorism, because so mostly international terrorists, they're a little bit different than domestic mass shooters, in the sense that often they can be educated. As Muhammad Atta was, he was an engineer. He was super bright. He was very soft-spoken, and he came from a very wealthy family, a very prominent Egyptian family, and a very religious and strict Egyptian family, obviously Muslim. And when he became this terrorist, he had a spiritual practice, which is he wrote a diary on how he would purify his body, and how all the other people who flew planes into the buildings would purify their body every day, every morning, and how they felt that they were teaching Westerners who were sinners, because Westerners listen to music, they date, they have sex, they drink, they smoke. These are all mortal sins, according to Muhammad Atta and strict fundamentalists who practice the Muslim religion feel. So he very much felt remorse. So he went to college. I don't remember where he went to college. I think it was either in America or in Europe. I think it was in America, but basically in college, he wasn't that strident. He wasn't a fundamentalist, and he dated. I think he probably drank alcohol, and he felt this incredible humiliation and remorse for that. And also, I think, was enraged for America with the wars that we waged in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, which was retaliatory and primitive in my mind. Mm-hmm. But more importantly than that, he was ridiculed and debased by a really sadistic father. His father called him, and I forget the word in Islam, or in Egyptian, little bird. He was very effeminate looking. He had a very beautiful face. He had really beautiful eyelashes, long eyelashes. And the father also mocked him and emasculated him and called him a mama's boy. And I believe a lot of the motivation psychologically for his actions were that he wanted to prove his potency to his father. He wanted to prove how powerful he was. He wanted to prove how masculine he was, that he wasn't his mama's boy or a coward or a sissy, that he was this potent, fearless, fundamentalist fighter who flew a plane into the World Trade Center building, and that he felt that fire in particular was the most purifying means of all means, to both purify him of his sins and Westerners of their sins. So it had this basis of the spiritual perversion of his believing that he would be purified, the Westerners who would be burned would be purified for their sins, and that he was going to prove to his father that he was this powerful warrior and he wasn't a mama's boy and a sissy. And it's very tragic. It's very tragic. He actually also wanted to go fight in the Chechen War on the sides of the Chechens. So he also was involved in all of that, and he became, very strictly religious, and then was involved in a lot of the training and wanted to go fight in the Chechen War. I don't think he did, but yeah, no, it's such a tragedy, and he's such a good example of what happens with international terrorists, because he was exploited, right? So he was depressed, most likely he was depressed. And then you have these people who are recruiters who are often sociopathic and narcissistic, and they know how to exploit people. And I do feel like he was used, he was exploited based on childhood feelings of impotency, and that, this was a spiritual, in my mind, a distorted spiritual way to purify him and Westerners of our sins.
Wow. Yeah, no, you can see that thread running through everything.